Hey everyone, this is a piece from the Ideas of Leon Trotsky, edited by Hillel, Ticktin, and Michael Cox. Um, the article is that I'm reading in this video is by Stephen Dabydeen or Dabydeen, and let's look him up. Looks like he might have a piece in. Let's see what he says on Taylor and. Oh, he has another article in Critique from 2001 called "Revolution and Nationality in Trotsky's History." That's from one website. I don't know if he has other. I don't know. Anyway, the article's titled "Trotsky, the United States of Europe, and National Self-Determination." Yeah, I was looking to see if there's anything on any United States of Europe Wikipedia entries, but I'm not seeing any. Um, I'm gonna read the Wikipedia article actually on self-determination, even though that's tedious, but I'm gonna do it. Self-determination refers to a people's right to form its own political entity, and internal self-determination is the right to representative government with full suffrage. Self-determination is a cardinal principle in modern international law, binding as such on the United Nations as an authoritative interpretation of the Charter's norms. The principle does not state how the decision is to be made, nor what the outcome should be, whether independence, federation, protection, some form of autonomy, or full assimilation. And the right of self-determination does not necessarily include a right to an independent state for every ethnic group within a former colonial territory. Further, no right to secession is recognized under international law. Self-determination emerged from the rise of nationalism in the 19th century and came into prominent use in the 1860s, spreading rapidly thereafter. During and after World War I, the principle was encouraged by both Soviet Premier Vladimir Lenin and the United States President Woodrow Wilson. Having announced his 14 points on the 8th of January 1918, on the 11th of February 1918, Wilson stated, quote, "National aspirations must be respected. People may now be dominated and governed only by their own consent." Quote, "Self-determination is not a mere phrase. It is an imperative principle of action," end quote. Woodrow Wilson. During World War II, the principle was included in the Atlantic Charter, jointly declared on the 14th of August 1914 by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States, and Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, who pledged the 8 principal points of the Charter. It was recognized as an international legal right after it was explicitly listed as a right in the UN Charter. Implementing the right to self-determination can be politically difficult, in part because there are multiple interpretations of what constitutes a people, and which groups may legitimately claim the right to self-determination. A World Court judge, Ivor Jennings, put it, quote, "The people cannot decide until somebody decides who are the people," end quote. So that's the intro to the national self-determination. So here we go. Introduction. Trotsky's revolutionary career divides easily into Trotsky's pre-revolutionary anti-Bolshevik and post-revolutionary Bolshevik periods, the turning point being Trotsky's rapprochement with Lenin and Leninism in mid-1917. It has been said that this momentous change of outlook and allegiance was the result of a trade-off with Lenin, in which the latter accepted Trotsky's idea of permanent revolution, while Trotsky, in turn, agreed to Lenin's conception of the Revolutionary Party. Footnote. See, for example, Ernest Mandel, Trotsky, A Study in the Dynamic of His Thought. The description for Ernest Mandel's Trotsky, A Study in the Dynamics of His Thought, or the Dynamic of His Thought, says, Leon Trotsky was the most important contributor to the development of revolutionary Marxism this century after Lenin. As exiled militant or Soviet statesman, party organizer or public orator, as political analyst, soldier or commentator on cultural trends, Trotsky was centrally involved in the world historic upheavals of Trotsky's time and foremost among the interpreters of their significance for socialism. Yet the fate of Trotsky's achievement was dramatically discrepant from Lenin's. At the latter's death in 1924, Lenin's revolutionary authority was at its zenith. In the Soviet Union, Lenin's writings were consecrated as repository of a finished dogma, quote, Leninism. Abroad, Lenin's thought was interpreted in a way much closer to its own original spirit by Georg Lukács, whose remarkable Lenin sought to elicit its unity and actuality for a later revolutionary generation. In polar contrast, factional assault, official disgrace and proscription, anathema and slander were the conditions of Trotsky's later life and activity, until his assassination in 1940 and the unvarying background of any reaffirmation of his heritage for decades afterwards. Systematic publication of Trotsky's writings was beyond the means of his political followers, whose internal discussions of his ideas were supplemented only by the attentions of liberal, where not reactionary academics. In the last decade, however, with the resurgence of the political formations associated with his name, Trotsky's political role and ideas have again become topics of vigorous debate among socialists. Ernest Mandel's book makes possible a necessary extension of this debate by providing the first ever synthetic account of the development of Trotsky's Marxism and its successive encounters with the key problems and crises of the epoch. The Russian Revolution and the theme of uneven development, the construction of revolutionary parties, the struggle against fascism and imperialism at large, the nature of Stalinism and the prospect of a full socialist democracy are all discussed in a compact study that makes a fitting and long overdue counterpart to Lukács' historic study of 50 years ago. Back to the text and footnote. Whether this is so is open to discussion. What is not open to dispute is the great gulf between between Lenin and Trotsky prior to 1917. This is vividly depicted in their frequent and violent denunciations of each other's positions during the pre-war years. Trotsky started hostilities with his notoriously vehement and penetrating critique of Lenin's theory of revolutionary organization set out in What is to be Done and in speeches at the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. And the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party's Wikipedia says, the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was held from the 30th of June to August 23rd, 1903, starting in Brussels, Belgium, until August 6th and ending in London, England. Probably as a result of diplomatic pressure from the Russian embassy, Belgian police had forced the delegates to leave the country on the 6th of August. The Congress finalized the creation of the Marxist Party in Russia, proclaimed at the First Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. This Congress brought the first split within the party between the Bolshevik faction led by Lenin and the Menshevik faction led by Martov. The organizing committee for convening the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was originally elected at the Bialystok Conference held in March 1902, but soon after the conference, all the committee members but one were arrested. At Lenin's suggestion, a new organizing committee was set up at a conference of social democratic committees held in November 1902 in Pskov. On this committee, the Iskrists had an overwhelming majority, citation needed. Under Lenin's guidance, citation needed, the organizing committee carried out extensive preparatory work for the Second Congress. Draft regulations for the convening of the Congress were adopted at a plenary session held in Orel in February 1903. Following this plenary session, members of the organizing committee twice visited the local party organizations with a view to assisting them in their work. With their participation, the local committees discussed the draft regulations, after which the organizing committee finally endorsed the regulations and approved a list of the local organizations entitled under them to represent the Congress. The organizing committee prepared for the Congress a detailed written report on its activities. There were 37 sessions and 51 delegates. Of these, 33 supported Iskra, the party newspaper, 5 backed the Bund, and 2 were economists, Marxists who believed workers should concentrate on economic demands rather than political demands, 6 delegates were neutral, citation needed, During the 15th session, the delegates voted in favor of supporting a dictatorship of the proletariat as it approved into the party program the paragraph, quote, "A necessary condition for this social revolution is the dictatorship of the proletariat, that is, conquest by the proletariat of such political power as will enable it to suppress any resistance by the exploiters." End quote. The Congress saw the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party split into Bolsheviks and Mensheviks as a result of a dispute between Lenin and Julius Martov over the major points of the party program. At the 22nd session, Lenin and Martov disagreed on the wording of the first party rule defining membership. Lenin proposed a party member should be someone, quote, "who recognizes the party's program and supports the party's program by material means and by personal participation in one of the party organizations," end quote. Martov's wording was slightly different, quote, "regular personal association under the direction of one of the party organizations," end quote. The dispute was about whether the party should have a loose membership or whether the party should be a party of professional revolutionaries. Georgy Plekhanov, founder of Russian Marxism, supported Lenin. Leon Trotsky, future leader of the Petrograd Soviet, backed Martov. The Congress voted 28 to 23 in Martov's favor, but Martov's support included the 7 Bundists and economists who would later walk out from the Congress. This left Lenin's faction in the majority, so Lenin called his faction the Bolsheviks or majoritarians. Martov accepted this, calling his faction the Mensheviks or minoritarians. Citation needed, end bracket. At the 27th Congress, one of the constituent groups of the party, the General Jewish Labor Bund, asked that the Bund would be recognized as the sole representative of the Jewish working class in Russia. A Bundist delegate tabled a motion that all Russian citizens should have the right to use their own language. Lenin and the Iskra group opposed the motion. It was defeated in a tie, 23 votes against 23 votes. However, a similar motion proposed by No Jordania, leader of the Transcaucasian Social Democrats, was passed. Moreover, the Bund proposed that the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party should have a federal structure, with the Bund as a constituent party. This was defeated 41 to 5 abstentions. Bolsheviks and Mensheviks were united in their opposition to the Bundist proposal, calling the Bundist proposal separatist, nationalist, and opportunist. After the Bundist proposal was rejected, the Bund withdrew from the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. 2 economists also walked out when the Congress decided that the Iskrists should represent the party abroad. The second Central Committee was elected at the Congress. Iskra's editorial board became the party's central organ and was cut from 6 to 3 members, Lenin, Plekhanov, and Martov. I think it might be Plekhanov is how you pronounce it. Back to the text. Lenin was excoriated as a, quote, caricature Robespierre, end quote, Trotsky, demagogic and malicious, and his proposed reconstruction of the party was dismissed as, quote, the practice of organized mistrust, which, end bracket, demands an iron fist, end quote, Trotsky. Trotsky's Our Political Tasks more rigorously elaborated his famous charge of, quote, substitutionism, end quote, against Lenin's, quote, Jacobin system. At its head will emerge a, quote, dictator, substituting himself for the Central Committee, and ultimately for the party and the people. Footnote. Buruk Knipaz's social and political thought of Leon Trotsky gives a convenient summary of Trotsky's earliest criticisms of Lenin. That will be on the channel, if it's not already by the time this video is released. The imputation to Lenin of an obsessively Blancist design for power is the thematic core of Trotsky's assessment in these pre-October years. From the other side, Lenin constructed a persisting image of Trotsky and Trotsky's activities which was the exact opposite. His typical and recurrent criticisms ran as follows, quote, Trotsky, ... possesses no ideological and political definiteness, ... bracket, Trotsky freely flits, end bracket, ... from one group to another, end quote, Lenin. Footnote, see Lenin's Disruption of Unity under the cover of Outcries for Unity. Collected Works, Volume 20. End footnote. Quote, it is impossible to argue with Trotsky on the merits of the issue because Trotsky holds no views whatever. We can and should argue with confirmed liquidators and Atzovis. ... In Trotsky's case, the thing to do is expose Trotsky as a diplomat of the smallest caliber. End quote. Lenin. Footnote. See Lenin's Trotsky's Diplomacy and a Certain Party Platform in Collected Works, Volume 17. Wikipedia says the Atzovis, or recallists, were a group of radical Bolsheviks who demanded to cease all participation of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in legal state establishments. In particular, to recall the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party representatives from the State Duma, hence the name, quote, to recall, end quote, is Atazvat in Russian. Among the prominent Atzovis were Alexander Bogdanov, Mikhail Pokrovsky, Anatoly Lunacharsky, and Andrei Bubnov. The debates among Bolsheviks whether to boycott the new constituency of the Russian parliament, known as the Third Duma, started after the defeat of the revolution in mid-1907 and the adoption of a new, highly restrictive election law. This faction subsequently organized itself in the Period Group from 1909. Back to the text. Oh, also, the Wikipedia says the liquidators, or liquidationists, were a faction of the Mensheviks who left in 1905, plus their ideological compatriots who remained, maintaining that the availability of legal participation in political life, the underground revolutionary party must be liquidated. Back to the text. Recalling the character created by his favorite novelist, M. Saltykov-Shchedrin, in 1911, Lenin even referred to his opponent as, quote, Judas Trotsky, end quote. Footnote. See Lenin's Judas Trotsky's Blush of Shame in Lenin's Collected Works, Volume 17. End footnote. Wikipedia says Mikhail Saltykov-Shchedrin lived from 1826 to 1889. Born Mikhail Yevgrafovich Saltykov, and known during his lifetime by the pen name Nikolai Shchedrin, was a major Russian writer and satirist of the 19th century. Saltykov-Shchedrin spent most of his life working as a civil servant in various capacities. After the death of poet Nikolai Nekrasov, Saltykov-Shchedrin acted as editor of a Russian literary magazine, Otechestvenia Zabisky, until the Tsarist government banned it in 1884. In his works, Saltykov mastered both stark realism and satirical grotesque, merged with fantasy. Saltykov-Shchedrin's most famous work, the family chronicle, The Golovlyov Family, published in 1880, and the novel The History of a Town, published in 1870, was translated as Foolsburg, became important works of 19th century fiction, and Saltykov is regarded as a major figure of Russian literary realism. Back to the text. Lenin's unflattering view of Trotsky also emerges in Lenin's essay of 1914 on self-determination. Quote, Trotsky, Lenin averred, quote, has never yet held a firm opinion on any important question of Marxism. Trotsky always contrives to worm his way into the cracks of any given difference of opinion and desert one side for the other, end quote. Lenin. The right of nations to self-determination. Footnote. See Lenin's The Right of Nations to Self-Determination. End footnote. Two questions naturally arise and may be briefly considered here. The first is about the large analytical bases spanning a range of theoretical and strategic issues on which these uncomradely comments rest as superstructures. The tips, as it were, of two icebergs moving towards collision, and eventually coalescence, in the darkness of Russia's political backwardness. Those issues, as we might infer from the passages above, concerned the nature of the coming Russian Revolution, the organization for implementing the coming revolution, the role of the peasantry and of Western proletariat aid, the concepts of imperialism, and socialist participation in Russian autocratic politics. On these questions, there was genuine rational disagreement between Lenin and Trotsky. For example, to Trotsky's program for permanent revolution, Lenin opposed his concept of the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, while Trotsky tended to underline the peasants' incapacity to organize and act independently. Lenin wanted to make use of the, quote, historically real and progressive historical content, end quote, of peasant socialism, as in Lenin's 1909 letter to Skvortsov-Stepanov. According to Wikipedia, Ivan Skvortsov-Stepanov lived from 1870 to 1928 and was a prominent Russian Bolshevik revolutionary and Soviet politician. Ivan Ivanovich Skvortsov-Stepanov was one of the oldest participants in the Russian revolutionary movement, as well as a Marxist writer, economist, historian, and journalist. Back to the text. There were also important specific differences over the attitude and tactics of Russian social democrats towards current political questions and alliances. Footnote. See Lenin's The Aim of the Proletarian Struggle in Our Revolution in Collected Works, Volume 15, and the article Historical Meaning of the Inter-Party Struggle in Russia in Collected Works, Volume 16, for Lenin's views on the main issues here, end footnote. The second question relates to the end footnote. The second question relates to the validity and fairness of the charges and countercharges each man flung across the great divide within the RSDLP. Here a curious feature may be observed. Each seemed to be accusing the other of sins he was apt to commit himself, while claiming virtues which he did not practice as consistently as he believed. We can reasonably argue, in fact, that they had more in common before their convergence in 1917 than they and later historians were able to perceive. For Trotsky was as strict essentialist and disciplinarian as Lenin, and his concept of permanent revolution can be criticized for the concept of permanent revolution's corporate or collective Blanchism. Lenin, on his part, was more democratically inclined, out of, quote, moral and prudential considerations, than Trotsky was willing to allow. On the other hand, it was more than a little ironic that Lenin should accuse Trotsky of a penchant for intrigue, petty diplomacy, and opportunism. An eye for the main chance and degree of, quote, flexibility, end quote, were prerequisites for success among the various fluid and scheming groups of Russian Social Democrats, as the instructive failure of Martov and arguably of Trotsky himself testifies. On theory, too, it was Lenin who did not hesitate to, quote, change his mind, end quote, or, quote, break new ground, end quote, according to one's viewpoint, when the situation demanded. Lenin did so in 1905 to 1906, especially on agrarian policy, in 1914, 1917, and again in 1921. The scale of convergence beneath the thick polemical cover gives credibility to Lenin's answer in July 1917, when asked what still kept him and Trotsky apart, that it was, quote, ambition, 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 end quote. Lenin. Footnote. See Isaac Deutscher, The Prophet Armed, Trotsky 1879 to 1921. New section. Lenin and the United States of Europe. One issue, however, which really did keep Lenin and Trotsky apart during the First World War was the famous slogan of the United States of Europe. It has particular relevance for us because it arose out of deeper differences over the national question, and therefore makes a convenient point of entry for a discussion of Trotsky's ideas in that area. It incidentally throws more light on what we have said about Lenin's readiness to alter policies, here in pursuit of a national Russian revolution, and on Trotsky's more steadfast and consistent stand on the necessity for international action. The search for slogans that would rally support for a Russian revolution and at the same time express genuinely socialist ideals took up much of Lenin's energies in the early months of the war. The first formulation of such devices was in September-October 1914 when his group called for, quote, socialist revolution, end quote, in Western Europe, quote, a democratic republic, end quote, in Russia. The, quote, conversion of the present imperialist war into a civil war, ... as the only correct proletarian slogan, end quote. End quote, the formation of a Republican United States of Europe, end quote. Lenin. Footnote. See The War in Russian Social Democracy by Lenin, Collected Works, Volume 21. End footnote. The difficulties involved in slogan making were clearly illustrated in the case of the most notorious, the call to turn the imperialist war into a civil war. It was soon brought home to Lenin that this concept not only made Lenin vulnerable to damaging accusations that Lenin was anti-Russian and indifferent to the suffering of Russian soldiers, but was acting as an agent of German imperialism. Lenin was obliged to respond, and Lenin gradually toned down, quote, civil war from being a positive good to being, quote, the lesser evil, end quote, while proclaiming in December 1914 his, quote, true, end quote, patriotism, and national pride as a great Russian. Footnote. See Lenin's On the National Pride of the Great Russians, in his Collected Works, Volume 21. End footnote. Quote, civil war thus became, quote, revolutionary defeatism, end quote, and Lenin carefully refrained, as Deutscher has noted, from calling on his followers to engage in positive sabotage of the Russian war effort. Footnote. See Deutscher. End footnote. The slogan of the United States of Europe first appeared in a set of theses on the war which Lenin presented to a group of Bolsheviks in Berna in the first week of September 1914. Lenin wrote as one of the immediate slogans, quote, propaganda for republics in Germany, Poland, Russia, etc., and for transforming of all the separate states of Europe into a Republican United States of Europe, end quote. Footnote. See Lenin's The Task of Revolutionary Social Democracy in the European War, end footnote. A month later, in his manifesto, titled The War in Russian Social Democracy, Lenin announced, quote, the formation of a Republican United States of Europe should be the immediate political slogan of Europe's social democrats. in contrast with the bourgeoisie, which is ready to, quote, promise, end quote, anything in order to draw the proletariat into the new mainstream, into in contrast with the bourgeoisie, which is ready to, quote, promise anything to draw the proletariat into the mainstream of chauvinism, the Social Democrats will explain that this slogan is absolutely false and meaningless without the revolutionary overthrow of the German, the Austrian, and the Russian monarchies, end quote. Lenin. Footnote. See Lenin's The War in Russian Social Democracy, Collected Works, Volume 21. End footnote. It will be noticed that the slogan of the United States of Europe was intended to answer an assumed desire on the part of European workers for transnational cooperation, to stop present and future fighting, and to counter bourgeois exploitation of such sentiments. There was, however, an internal difficulty or contradiction in Lenin's scheme between the call, on the one hand, for a United States of Europe, and the aim, on the other, of overthrowing the Russian and Austrian empires, where self-determination, another slogan, will be both cause and effect in the process of succession. The difficulty was that a united Europe was really twice as far away as, quote, revolutionary overthrow, end quote, made it seem, since unification would only come about after self-determination had led to secession, and a period of independent statehood for the former, quote, oppressed, end quote, nationalities. As this point emerged, it was not surprising that the slogan of the United States of Europe lost favor and survived only a few months as part of Bolshevik propaganda and policy. It was in effect jettisoned by the Conference of Foreign Bolsheviks in March 1915 when it was announced that, quote, on the question of the, quote, United States of Europe, end quote, slogan, the discussion was purely political, it being decided that the question be deferred pending a discussion in the press of the economic aspect of the matter, end quote. Footnote. See Lenin's Conference of the Foreign Sections of the Bolsheviks in Collected Works, Volume 21. End footnote. 4 months later, Lenin published the article which ended his party's involvement with that slogan. By early 1915, therefore, Lenin was beginning to have serious doubts about the slogan of the United States of Europe. But it was not until August 1915 that Lenin published his full reconsideration of the whole issue in the article on the slogan for a United States of Europe, which was to become a crucial document in the later Stalin-Trotsky struggle. It therefore bears close examination. Lenin began by noting, quote, the one-sided political character, end quote, of the debate on the United States of Europe proposals and the neglect of its, quote, economic side, of the most important question of its economic content and meaning, end quote. Lenin. Somewhat paradoxically, Lenin proceeded to defend the validity of the slogan of the United States of Europe as a purely political concept, quote, to argue against such a political approach to the question while remaining entirely in the field of political analysis, is entirely erroneous, end quote, Lenin declared. This was a reaffirmation of Lenin's steady commitment to the importance and autonomy of politics, political forms, and political action, and underlined his favorable assessment of truly bourgeois democratic political ideals and institutions. We should note two elements in Lenin's positive evaluation of politics. The first was the idea of bourgeois democracy as a precondition of socialism. Quote, political changes of a truly democratic nature, we call that the proposal of the United States of Europe depend on their prior, quote, revolutionary overthrow, on the prior, quote, revolutionary overthrow, end quote, of the reactionary autocracies in Germany, Austria, and Russia, can never obstruct or weaken the slogan of socialist revolution. On the contrary, they always make it nearer and widen the basis for it, drawing into the socialist struggle ever new strata, end quote, Lenin. The second element pertained to the non-economic dimensions of the process of socialism. Quote, political revolutions, end quote, Lenin reiterated, quote, are inevitable in the course of a socialist revolution, which must not be looked upon as a single act, but must be considered as an epoch, a number of stormy political and economic upheavals, a most sharpened class struggle, civil war, revolutions and counter-revolutions, end quote. Lenin. This concept was of pivotal importance in Lenin's thinking. Therefore, Lenin concludes, the slogan of the United States of Europe, quote, is entirely impregnable as a political slogan, end quote. That is, as a slogan for the democratic revolution, which was a necessary condition for socialist change. If that is the case, we may not unreasonably inquire, why discard the slogan at all? Lenin's answer added up to a definition of the limits and constraints of the autonomy of politics, his view of its ultimate dependence on, quote, economic content and meaning, end quote. The United States of Europe was envisaged as a democratic entity, but however radical its democracy, he considered that it would still be circumscribed by the bourgeois capitalist economic framework, that is, to use the terms of Lenin's own characterization of contemporary conditions, by the imperialist stage of capitalism. It was, Lenin argued, this specific and ultimate form of capitalism and its imperatives that proponents of the slogan of the United States of Europe had tended to overlook. If we understand the concept, quote, United States, to include an idea of, quote, unification, and the idea of a, quote, state, the requirements or desiderata of imperialism could and would accommodate a, quote, state element of a particular conservative nature, but would not tolerate for long the Europe-wide, quote, unification, which the left-wing socialists had in mind. In Lenin's words, quote, from the point of view of the economic conditions of imperialism, that is, capital exports and division of the world, the United States of Europe under capitalism is either impossible or reactionary, end quote. Lenin. Footnote. See Lenin's article on the slogan for a United States of Europe, published in his Collected Works, Volume 21. End footnote. Lenin validated the, quote, impossibility, end quote, part of this thesis by outlining what was a succinct preview of the theory of imperialism, which Lenin was then developing and would present more fully the following year. In the, quote, epoch of the highest capitalist development, end quote, Lenin wrote, capital become, quote, international and monopolistic, and the world has been divided among a handful of great powers, end quote. Under capitalism, quote, only force is possible as the basis, the principle of division, end quote. One cannot divide the income otherwise than in proportion to power, and power inevitably changes in the course of economic development. With capitalism, which is private property and the means of production and anarchy in production, quote, equal economic progress of the individual concerns or individual states is impossible, and no other means for periodically re-establishing destroyed equilibrium are possible outside the crises in industry or war and politics, end quote. Even capitalist development meant that, quote, war is no contradiction to the foundations of private property, It is a direct and inevitable development of those foundations, end quote. Lenin. This Clausewitzian formula. Lenin was immersed in the works of the German military theorist at this time, signified that a United States of Europe, which is in fact the goal of the ultra-imperialist strategy for dividing colonies, quote, justly, end quote, was an impossible dream, parenthesis, quote, dream, end quote. It is interesting to note, recurs as Lenin's frequent criticism of his left opposition's policies, end parenthesis. Lenin conceded that, quote, temporary agreements between capitalists and states are possible, end quote, but insisted that such a temporary union of the states of Europe would necessarily be deeply reactionary, the second part of Lenin's thesis, and totally unsuited to socialist aims or strategy, because its raison d'etre was the desire, firstly, to combine against the proletariat and socialism in Europe, and, secondly, to preserve a backward and stagnating European economic hegemony in the colonial world against the more dynamic and dissatisfied emergent capitalisms of the United States and Japan. Quote, on the present-day economic basis, that is, under European capitalism, the United States of Europe would mean an organization of reaction for thwarting the more rapid development of America, The days when the cause of democracy and socialism was associated with Europe alone have passed forever, end quote. Lenin. Having disposed of the question of the United States of Europe, Lenin could logically have ended his article at this point, but Lenin felt it necessary to go on to deal with Trotsky's further reference to the United States of the world. It was in the course of criticizing this idea, not the slogan of the United States of Europe, that Lenin made some of his most resonant and fateful remarks about socialist prospects. The United States of the world, Lenin said, will become a reality, quote, only when the full victory of communism will have brought about the total disappearance of any state, including its democratic form, end quote. In this sense, the concept relates to the very distant future, not to any practical contemporary concern. Quote, as a separate slogan, however, end quote, Lenin continued, quote, the United States of the world would hardly be a correct one. First, because it merges with socialism. Second, because it might be wrongly interpreted to mean that the victory of socialism in a single country is impossible. And it may also create misconceptions as to the relations of such a country to the others, end quote. Lenin. This celebrated, even notorious passage is explained by Lenin in a short paragraph. Footnote. At this point, we should bear in mind that, quote, socialism refers to the, quote, lower stage of communism, as Marx defined it in his critique of the Gotha program, which will give way to, quote, full communism, end quote. Lenin includes the revolution itself and its immediate reconstructive aftermath in his consistent and precise usage of, quote, socialism. End footnote. The, quote, erroneous interpretations, unquote, Lenin had in mind, but did not explicitly describe, was the view that the concept of the United States of the world entailed the notion of the simultaneity of the Russian and European revolutions. The, quote, misconceptions, end quote, created by this view included quietism, or, more precisely, the international socialist version of Lenin's oldest enemy, quote, tail-endism, with its proposal, parenthesis, implied rather than stated by Lenin here, in parenthesis, that socialists in one country should wait until all other countries were ready to start the revolution before themselves acting. One second. Back to the text. Sorry, I was trying to see if there's like a Wikipedia or something for tailism, but I didn't see anything. There's a bunch of articles by various, Trotsky's tribes, but, not seeing any. That really popped out as like, oh, here's a paragraph about it. Anyway, in Lenin's mind, the main theoretical weapon against such errors was the thesis that, quote, unequal economic and political development is an absolute law of capitalism, end quote. It followed from this, against the, quote, simultaneity idea, end quote, which Trotsky may fairly be said to have championed, that, quote, the victory of socialism is, at the beginning, possible in a few capitalist countries, even in one taken separately, end quote. Footnote. See Lenin's On the Slogan for a United States of Europe, Collected Works, Volume 21, end footnote. This, of course, became the locus classicus of subsequent disputes where the theory of socialism in one country was claimed to have been first propounded authoritatively. We may sound a cautionary note and argue that Lenin's expression of the, quote, theory was tentative and qualified, as the words, quote, beginning, quote, possible, and, quote, even in one, indicate. More important, this single sentence on socialism in one, or a separate country, was not further explained, but was directly followed in the rest of the paragraph by Lenin's elucidation of his anti-quietist, anti-tail-endist policy for the hypothetical first socialist regime. Lenin's policy aim for that isolated socialist country was to use it as a base to spread the revolution immediately and uninterruptedly against the states that had not yet gone over to socialism. Quote, after expropriating the capitalists and organizing their own socialist production, the victorious proletariat of that country will arise against the rest of the world, the capitalist world, attracting to its cause the oppressed classes of other countries, stirring uprisings in those countries against the capitalists, and in case of need, using even armed force against the exploiting classes and their states. End quote. Lenin further suggested that the main rationale for the political form of the new socialist regime, the dictatorship of the proletariat, was, quote, more and more, bracket, to, and bracket, concentrate, end quote, the forces of the socialist nation or nations for, quote, prolonged and stubborn struggle, end quote, against the capitalist states. Footnote. See Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, Volume 3. See the whole later passage, which argues, like earlier ones, that a national revolution is, quote, a necessary link, end quote, in the struggle of the international proletariat. End footnote. Wait, shit. That was the wrong... Sorry. That was the wrong footnote. There's no footnote. The overall impact of this militant policy statement was to modify considerably, reinforcing the verbal qualifiers noted, Lenin's, quote, anti-simultaneity, end quote, conception of socialism in one country, and so to bring his outlook much closer than is usually recognized for his pre-1917 period to Trotsky's conception of permanent or uninterrupted revolution. Whether the differences which undoubtedly remained between them conveniently but misleadingly encapsulated in the phrase, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, are central or marginal, was and is a matter for reasonable debate. New section. Trotsky and the United States of Europe. Unlike Lenin's tactical propagandist adoption of this slogan, Trotsky's call for a United States of Europe grew logically out of Trotsky's theory of the, quote, permanent character of revolution in an imperialist epoch, end quote, and of, quote, the subordination of belated national revolutions to the revolution of the proletariat, end quote. Footnote. Trotsky, History of the Russian Revolution, Volume 3. See the whole later passage, which argues, like earlier ones, that a national revolution is, quote, a necessary link, end quote, in the struggle of the international proletariat. End footnote. In November 1914, in articles which later formed the book War and the International, Trotsky called for the self-determination of subject nations, not as an end but as a means to their freely joining an international socialist system. Quote, in the present historical conditions, the proletariat is not interested in defending an anachronistic national, quote, fatherland, end quote, which has become the main impediment to economic advance, but in the creation of a new, more powerful and stable fatherland, the Republican United States of Europe, the foundation for the United States of the world. To the imperialist blind alley of capitalism, the proletariat can oppose only the socialist organization of world economy as the practical program of the day, end quote. Trotsky, War and the International. Notably here is Trotsky's characteristic emphasis on productive technological needs and possibilities as the prime cause of historical change. A few months later, in February 1915, Trotsky brought into his argument the crucial political factors working for the validity of the concept of the United States of Europe when Trotsky asserted that, quote, the war was breaking up the nation state and was also destroying the national basis for revolution, end quote. thus creating the conditions for simultaneous and interdependent socialist revolution in Europe. Trotsky responded to Lenin's criticism directly and forcefully in the second part of an article in April 1916 entitled, quote, "The United States of Europe," end quote. We shall look first at his specific rebuttal of Lenin's argument and then move on to examine its general theoretical grounding in Trotsky's concept of self-determination. Quote, "The only concrete historical consideration against the slogan of the United States of Europe was formulated by the Swiss Social Democrat, that is Lenin, as follows. Quote, "The unevenness of economic and political development is the unconditional law of capitalism," end quote. Lenin. From this, the Swiss Social Democrat draws the conclusion that the victory of socialism is possible in one country, and that it is needless, therefore, to make the dictatorship of the proletariat in each isolated state conditional upon the creation of the United States of Europe, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote. This and following quotations from Leon Trotsky's article United States of Europe from early 1916, part 4 of the pamphlet Programma Mira, which consists of a series of articles published in January to April 1916. It is included in his collection War and Revolution, Part 2. I think that's what that means. Vojna I Revolucja, Part 2, 1923. It is this version which is used and referred to in the present discussion. The program Mira is also to be found in Trotsky's Sochenenia. I have quoted mainly from the translation made by John G. Wright entitled, quote, "The Program of Peace," which was published in May 1942 issue of Fourth International, the Journal of the U.S. Socialist Workers' Party, by Celanese Trotskyists in the booklet, What is a Peace Program? Colombo, 1956, and in the summer 1984 issue of Permanent Revolution, the Journal of Workers' Power, the British section of the League for a Revolutionary Communist International. End footnote. Trotsky's further refutation rested on his crucial revision of Lenin's basic law of uneven capitalist development. Trotsky wrote, quote, "That the capitalist development of various countries is uneven is incontestable, but this unevenness is itself extremely uneven," end quote. In concrete terms, the capitalist levels of England, Austria, Germany, or France are not the same, but, quote, "compared with Africa and Asia, all these countries represent capitalist, quote, Europe, which is ripe for social revolution," end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky seemed to be moving towards an idea of, quote, "socialism in one continent," end quote, in place of Lenin's, quote, "socialism in one country," end quote. Trotsky's further criticisms of Lenin's position showed up the thin line between the opportunism and orthodoxy for revolutionary social democrats as they sought to utilize the war for their own purposes. On the one hand, Trotsky conceded to Lenin that, quote, "it is necessary to repeat the elementary thought that no single country must, quote, wait," end quote, for the others, lest the idea of parallel international action be supplanted by the idea of procrastinating international action, end quote. Trotsky urged that revolutionaries should begin and continue the struggle, quote, on, quote, "our own national soil," end quote, without waiting for others, in the certainty that their struggle will spark revolution in other countries. But Trotsky stuck to his central point that, quote, "it is hopeless to think, that revolutionary Russia can maintain herself in the face of conservative Europe, or that a socialist Germany could remain isolated in a capitalist world," end quote. Trotsky. On the other hand, Trotsky at the same time, and more sharply, interpreted Lenin as going beyond this elementary truth about the initiating role of single countries, and, quote, "succumbing to the same national narrowness that forms the content of social patriotism," end quote. It was a startling accusation which bracketed Lenin, the scourge of the chauvinist, in the same category as Vaillant, Lench, Chernov et al., who had sought to justify the defense of their respective nation on the grounds that it alone was the representative and champion of true socialist ideas. Let's look some of these characters up. The Vallon appears to be referring to Marie Edouard Vaillant, who's mostly known as Edouard Vaillant. Born in Vierzon-Cher, son of a lawyer, Edouard Vaillant studied engineering at the École Centrale des Arts et Manufactures, graduating in 1862, and then law at the Sorbonne. In Paris, Edouard Vaillant knew Charles Longuet, Louis-Auguste Roguer, Jules Vallée. A reader of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon's writings, he met Proudhon and joined the International Working Men's Association. Edouard Vaillant went to study in Germany in 1866. At the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, Edouard Vaillant returned to Paris. It was during the siege of Paris that Vaillant met Auguste Blanqui. Vaillant opposed the government of national defense and took part in the revolts on the 31st of October 1870 and the 22nd of January 1871. Edouard Vaillant was one of the 4 editors of the Affiche Rouge, red poster, calling for the creation of the Paris Commune. In the elections of February 1871, Edouard Vaillant stood as a revolutionary socialist candidate for the National Assembly but was not elected. In March 1871, Edouard Vaillant was elected by the 20th arrondissement, I don't know if I'm saying that right, to the Council of the Commune, where Edouard Vaillant oversaw work on education. Following the bloody suppression of the Commune in late May 1871, Vaillant fled France with Eugène Boudin for Great Britain, where Vaillant was part of the Blancist tendency of the First International. Edouard Vaillant was sentenced to death in absentia in July 1872 and did not return to France until the General Amnesty of 1880. Active in socialist politics, Vaillant was elected to the Chamber of Deputies in 1893, representing the 20th arrondissement. Although Edouard Vaillant had earlier been a convinced revolutionary in the chamber, Edouard Vaillant generally followed a middle ground between the, quote, revolutionaries, represented by Jules Gued, and the, quote, reformist, represented by Jean Jaurès. Edouard Vaillant was among the founding members of the French section of the Workers' International SFIO, a socialist party uniting revolution and revolutionary reformist groups. Vaillant supported a general strike to prevent French participation in the First World War, but following the assassination of Jaurès and the outbreak of war, Vaillant joined the majority of socialists in supporting the Union Sacrée, the Sacred Union, and harshly criticized pacifist members of the SFIO in Edouard Vaillant's speeches. Edouard Vaillant died in Paris on the 18th of December 1915. Schools in his birthplace of Vierzon and in Gennevilliers are named in Edouard Vaillant's honor. Okay, that was a little longer than I wanted it to be, but I think we learned some interesting things. Wikipedia says Paul Lensch lived from 1873 to 1926. Paul Lensch was a war journalist, editor, and author of several books, and politician in the SPD. From 1912, Lensch was a member of the German Reichstag for the SPD, and in 1919 he became professor of economics at Berlin University. Back to the text, Chernov. Wikipedia says Viktor Chernov this might be who was being referred to, was a Russian revolutionary and one of the founders of the Russian Socialist Revolutionary Party. Viktor Chernov was the primary party theoretician, or the, quote, brain of the party, and was more of an analyst than a political leader. Following the February Revolution of 1917, Viktor Chernov was Minister for Agriculture in the Russian Provisional Government and advocated immediate land reform. Later on, Viktor Chernov was chairman of the Russian Constituent Assembly. All right, back to the text. Trotsky went on to identify the precise element in Lenin's, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, which vitiated his attempt to, quote, view the prospects of social revolution within national frameworks, end quote. He noted, quote, that in social patriotism there is, in addition to the most vulgar reformism, a national revolutionary messianism, which regards its national state as chosen for introducing to humanity, quote, socialism, or, quote, democracy, be it on the grounds of its industrial development or its democratic form and revolutionary conquests, end quote. Trotsky. Any such defense, Trotsky declared, of the, quote, national basis of the revolution, end quote, undermined proletarian internationalism and the revolution itself, quote, which cannot begin otherwise than on the national basis, but which cannot be completed on the basis owing to the present economic and political military interdependence of the European states, The slogan, quote, the United States of Europe, end quote, expressed this interdependence, end quote. Trotsky. In alleging a national messianic factor at work in Lenin's abandonment of the United States of Europe proposal, Trotsky, we believe, undoubtedly had in mind Lenin's apparently ambivalent article of December 1914 titled On the National Pride of the Great Russians. There, Lenin, as if to affirm his great Russian credentials, had eulogized the revolutionary, democratic, and socialist achievements of the great Russian nation. Trotsky detected a further self-contradiction in Lenin's standpoint because its alleged messianism and its clear rejection of defensism. Quote, if the problem of socialism were compatible with the framework of the national state, then it, socialism, would thereby become compatible with national defense, end quote. In other words, if Lenin really believed that socialism could be established in, say, Russia, then Lenin was logically bound to concede the necessity and the social democratic legitimacy of the defense of Russia against its enemies. The validity of, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, implied the validation of this, of, quote, this messianism bound up with the program of national defense, end quote. There is a bitter double irony in this criticism, the full force of which can only be appreciated if we remember that, quote, national defense, end quote, was the hallmark of the Second International Socialism's, quote, treachery and, quote, social chauvinism in the eyes of Lenin and his revolutionary left-wing comrades. Trotsky himself had on a previous page counterposed to the, quote, conservative defense of the antiquated national fatherland, end quote, the, quote, creation, bracket, and presumably the defense, end bracket, of a new, higher, quote, fatherland, end quote, of the revolution, Republican Europe, end quote. Secondly, and more important, Trotsky was correct in drawing out the implications of national defensism from the doctrine of socialism in one country, but was mistaken in thinking that Trotsky was thereby convicting Lenin of incoherence. For, excluding any reference to messianism, end parenthesis, Lenin's policy of revolutionary defensism, the defense of the socialist Russian state created by a democratic revolution, end parenthesis, was presented as self-consistent and logical in essentially the same terms as Trotsky was using in his inferential argument here. It was not only by immanent analysis, bringing to light dubious propositions and internal contradictions, that Trotsky sought to refute Lenin's rethinking on the idea of the United States of Europe, but also by head-on disagreement. He admitted the force of Lenin's main conclusion that in the existing conditions of imperialist war, though their definitions of imperialism did not coincide, A reunification of Europe would be at most partial and at best reactionary, since it would be in the form of a, quote, compulsory military tariff union, end quote, against, quote, the weak and backward peoples, and especially against their own working classes, end quote. But against, quote, certain opponents of the program of the United States of Europe, end quote, that is the Leninists, end parenthesis, who focused on the program of the United States of Europe's, quote, reactionary monarchist imperialist content, end quote. Trotsky boldly counterattacked by asserting that, quote, it is precisely this prospect that provides the most graphic testimony in favor of the revolutionary viability of the slogan of the United States of Europe, end quote. What, he asked in his best rhetorical manner, would be the best slogan for the European workers in the likely eventuality of such a reactionary union? Would it be the dissolution of the reactionary United States of Europe and the, quote, return of all peoples under the roof of isolated national states, end quote, with the restoration of national tariffs, national currencies, and social legislation, etc.? Utilizing a basic distinction, he argued that the revolutionary proletarian program could only be, quote, the destruction of the forced anti-democratic form, ... and the preservation and consolidation of the foundations of such, end quote, of such imperialist unification. This fundamental point he put more uncompromisingly in a later passage, quote, if the capitalist states of Europe succeeded in merging into an imperialist trust, this would be a step forward as compared with the existing situation, for it would first of all create a unified, all-European material basis for the working class movement, end quote. Trotsky. It is instructive to compare Lenin's pessimism of will with Trotsky's optimism of intelligence at this juncture, 1 year or so into the war. In Lenin's mind, as we have noted, quote, Europe as a whole denotes economic stagnation. Under capitalism, the United States of Europe would signify an organizational reaction to retard America's more rapid development, end quote. Lenin. Footnote. See Lenin's On the Slogan for United States of Europe, end footnote. Trotsky, on the other hand, saw even such a Europe as a decisive, quote, step forward, end quote, a structure uniquely ripe for conversion to a, quote, European Republican Federation, end quote, and then, without delay, ready for the revolutionary transition to a socialist United States of Europe. Trotsky combined in one passage his antipathy to Lenin's socialism in one country and demotion of Europe's revolutionary prospects when he wrote, quote, Europe is not only a geographic term, but a certain economic and cultural historical community. The European Revolution does not have to wait for the revolutions in Asia and Africa, nor even in Australia and America, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote. See Trotsky's The United States of Europe. And as we reflect on that first sentence, which is entirely consonant with Trotsky's general outlook, we begin to suspect that his description of a European, quote, community, end quote, is a subtle reconceptualization of the continent as one nation or country containing and transcending the conventional component, quote, nations, such as Russia, Germany, and England. We can go further and articulate what was the latent meaning of Trotsky's words, that it was this, quote, Europe as one nation, end quote, which was the appropriate subject of Lenin's strategy of self-determination, whose result would be really, quote, socialism in one country writ large, end quote, on a continental scale. The constituent, quote, nations, in the ordinary sense, would then be conceived as the real subjects of Trotsky's own theory of self-determination, which was designed and intended to facilitate at most a limited and temporary movement towards Lenin's idea of, quote, socialism in one country. New section, Trotsky and self-determination. Trotsky's main argument against self-determination was, quote, that the national state has outlived itself as a framework for the development of the productive forces, as a basis for the class struggle, and thereby also as a state form of the proletarian dictatorship, end quote. Trotsky. Of these three categories, the first, the development of the productive forces, is given primacy and an emphasis which is typical of Trotsky's Marxism, in which, quote, production technology, end quote, needs and forces are sometimes described as if they constitute a determining, autonomous, teleonomic entity with the capacity to evaluate and adopt or reject political superstructures, forms of the state, and concepts and structures of national self-determination were to be assessed in relation to the inexorable historical drive towards higher productivity, so that the system of independent national states, and therefore the right of each nation to independent statehood, which at one stage aided and assisted productive economic growth, might at a later stage become a federal and further development, and would need to be reconstructed or discarded. In this interpretation, the complex concept of the, quote, nation-state was reanalyzed by Trotsky, and the, quote, state component was expanded near to its breaking point, while the, quote, nation, the apparently more durable, probably permanent entity was given a new self-image. The article, titled The Right of Nations to Self-Determination, written in 1915-16, is the clearest presentation of Trotsky's position on this central and controversial question. Trotsky admitted the right of nations to self-determination as a, quote, democratically unquestionable right, end quote, on two somewhat different grounds. It was, firstly, a weapon in the struggle for a genuine, socialist, quote, peace without annexations, end quote, and against imperialist war. Trotsky noted that self-determination in this sense was the historical bourgeois conception, which Lenin recognized, end parenthesis, of the right of nations to separate national states, parenthesis, quote, the meaning of self-determination is the cancellation of existing states, state and economic decentralization, end quote, and parenthesis. It was also the logical and effective, quote, internal, ideological riposte against imperialism, which Trotsky conceived as, quote, by its very nature expansive and aggressive, end quote, aiming at the extension of state borders, at the compulsory incorporation of weak states, and the acquisition of new colonies, end quote. Footnote, this and the following quotations from Leon Trotsky's article, The Right of Nations to Self-Determination. However, as an exterior weapon against imperialist activities, aggrandizement, exploitation, war, this bourgeois conception of self-determination, historically attested and theoretically validated, was in Trotsky's mind limited and already obsolescent. Firstly, self-determination was claimed and exercised by the great powers themselves, who used it to justify the imposition of their will on weaker countries. In this way, it had come to mean, quote, my might is my right, end quote. Secondly, this right of self-determination could only be exercised by means of a referendum, and Trotsky's criticism here was, and remained, that, quote, this obligatory democratic response will, remain purely formal. It does not tell us anything about the real possibilities, ways and means of national self-determination under the modern conditions of capitalist economy, end quote. Most significant was his third reason, which takes us to the heart of Trotsky's argument. The conventional concept of self-determination tended towards the, quote, dismemberment of present states, end quote. Quote, economic decentralization, end quote. The fragmentation of existing economic political amalgamations into small, separate national states. Trotsky asserted that such an outcome cannot and should not be accepted or promoted by socialists. In the first place, the facts were against it, quote, the powerful centralist tendencies of imperialism, which has at its disposal the state organization and its military power, end quote, will ensure that any, quote, new state boundaries will not be decided on the basis of the national principle, but on the basis, of military forces, end quote. More important than sheer military power was the inevitable direction of capitalism. Trotsky made this point in a parable or metaphor which is remarkable for its conciseness and penetration. If, Trotsky said, by a miracle Europe were to be partitioned again into fixed national states through bourgeois self-determination, the national question would not thereby be solved. Quote, the very next day after this, quote, just, end quote, national redivision, capitalist expansion would resume its work, end quote, creating conflicts, quote, wars and new acquisitions in gross violation of the national principle, end quote, in all cases where that principle cannot be held by force of arms. Quote, it would all give the impression of inveterate gamblers being forced to divide the gold, quote, justly among themselves in the middle of the game in order to start the same game all over again with redoubled frenzy, end quote, and with the same outcome, a few big winners and many small losers. Trotsky's argument flowed on towards its decisive turn. If, on the one hand, national self-determination meant and could only mean one thing, the historical bourgeois right to a separate national state, and if, on the other, imperialism was the unique, inevitable, and natural development of capitalism, then socialists should despair, since the alternatives they faced would be futile heroics for the sake of national states doomed to obsolescence or, quote, passive submission to inevitable imperialist centralization. Trotsky moved to dissolve the dilemma by redefining the major terms of the syllogism. National self-determination was not essentially and eternally political, to be realized only in the formation of a national state, nor was imperialism the unique and inescapable form of the highest phase of capitalism. To put it concisely, Trotsky argued that the nation had become in the modern epoch an essentially cultural entity, as compared to the previous era when the nation's economic, political nature was primary, and that imperialism was not, as the Leninist view had it, capitalism in capitalism's most developed, quote, natural form, but an avoidable perversion of capitalism's highest stages. Buttressing these redefinitions was Trotsky's central theorem about the, quote, irresistible and deeply progressive tendency of modern economic life towards a planned organization throughout our continent, and further all over the globe, end quote. In the light of such reasoning, Trotsky urged socialists to shed no tears over even the imperialist crushing of separatist aspirations and offered them a compensatory formula, an alternative, viable, non-Leninist concept of national self-determination. Obsolete national states and distorted imperialist centralism did not invalidate respectively nationality and centralism. Dealing with the problem of the nation, Trotsky started with his key definition, quote, a national community is the living hearth of culture, as the national language is its living organ, and these will still retain their significance through indefinitely long historical periods, end quote. Social democrats, Trotsky went on, want and have the obligation to, quote, safeguard to the national community its freedom of development or dissolution, or dissolution, end parenthesis, in the interest of material and spiritual culture. It is in this sense that we have taken over from the revolutionary bourgeoisie the democratic principle of national self-determination as a political obligation, end quote, meaning an obligation on the part of the centralized state, not on its component nations, to provide the national freedom of self-expression. We can expect, from the emphasis on culture and the context of imperialist expansion, that Trotsky's concept of self-determination would be a variation of the Austro-Marxist program for national cultural autonomy. The rights of national groups as such cannot be allowed to go beyond such autonomy and demand the right to secede and set up independent states. Quote, the right of national self-determination, end quote, Trotsky insisted, quote, cannot be excluded from the proletarian peace program, but the right of national self-determination cannot claim absolute importance. On the contrary, The right of national self-determination is delimited for us by the converging (unifying) profoundly progressive tendencies of historical development. Trotsky. Lenin, too, we recall, had stressed the non-absolute nature of the social democrats, commitment to self-determination up to secession. But on political strategic grounds, not Trotsky's economic historical basis. The self-determination of nations must be one counterweight to imperialist centralization, which enslaved weak peoples and crushed, quote, the hearths of national cultures, end quote. On the other hand, the proletariat cannot allow the national principle to hinder the progressive tendency towards larger and more integrated economic areas. Quote, from the standpoint of historical development and of the tasks of social democracy, the tendency of modern economy is fundamental, and it must be guaranteed the fullest opportunity of accomplishing its truly liberationist historical mission to construct the united world economy independent of national frames, state and tariff barriers, ... end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky concluded his argument with the following conspectus on self-determination, quote, Poles, ... Serbians and other small weak European nations not yet annexed may be reinstated or set up for the first time in the national configurations towards which they gravitate. Above all, they will be able to remain within these configurations and freely develop their cultural existence only to the extent to which as national groupings they will cease to be economic groupings, will not be bound by state borders, will not be separated from or opposed to one another economically, end quote. Nations now split by and placed among different states can, of course, only be unified if those state boundaries are abolished, but they will only be able to survive and prosper within a single state framework, enlarged, quote, as an economic but not as a national organization until it embraces the whole of capitalist Europe, end quote. We may now see the sense and meaning of Trotsky's apparently paradoxical statement that, quote, the state unification of Europe is clearly a prerequisite of the self-determination of great and small nations of Europe, end quote. New section, Trotsky, Europe, and the Nation. It will be useful here to examine more closely Trotsky's idea of the political and economic unification of Europe, which alone could offer the possibility of real, quote, national cultural existence, end quote, to all nations. It will have a federal structure as one might expect from Trotsky's general sympathy with the Austrian Bauer-Springer constitutional principles. One second. Trotsky declared that only a European federative republic can, quote, put flesh and blood, end quote, into the right to self-determination. Secondly, it will be a, quote, democratically united, end quote, Europe, free from state and tariff barriers, as opposed to the predatory anti-democratic integration being enforced by imperialist war. Thirdly, it will be revolutionary in the radical democratic sense, and therefore transitional towards the united socialist world economy. The meaning of, quote, revolutionary at this point in Trotsky's career will become clear when we analyze a passage in which Trotsky distinguished Trotsky's self-determination concept from that of fellow or rival social democrats. The touchstone for social democrats on the national question, from Marx and Engels onward, had been Polish independence, and it's not surprising that Trotsky should use it to distinguish his viewpoint from that of Lenin. Trotsky criticized, without naming Lenin's stand in favor of Poland's political self-determination in contemporary circumstances. Trotsky argued that the, quote, independence of Poland, ... outside the European Revolution, end quote, was not possible, given the, quote, immediate dependence of national self-determination of weak peoples on the democratized collective European regime, end quote. Lenin's scheme was obliquely characterized as, quote, utopian. Trotsky's second target was the German socialist chauvinists or ultra-imperialists Lynch and Kanov, who had agreed that imperialist expansion and integration made the principle of national independence merely, quote, reactionary romanticism, end quote, clearly obsolete in any of its meanings, cultural, political, or economic. And the Lynch being referred to is Paul Lynch, Lensch, who lived from 1873 to 1926. Paul Lynch was a war journalist, editor, author of several books, and politician in the SPD. From 1912, Lynch was a member of the German Reichstag for the SPD, and in 1919, Paul Lynch became professor of economics at Berlin University. Back to the text. Oh no. Kanov. Heinrich Kanov was a German Social Democratic Party politician and prominent Marxist theorist. Kanov, I don't know how to say it, Cunow, was originally against the First World War in 1914. But Kanov changed his viewpoint. In 1915, he joined Paul Lynch and Konrad Heinisch in the Lynch-Kanov-Heinisch group. Kanov argued that German imperialism was progressive, as antiquated methods of production by primitive people was swept aside by modernization and industrial growth. In this period, Kanov denounced the statement by the Social Democratic Parliamentary Group in defense of a universal right of self-determination for all people. Rather being a natural right, Kanov defended self-determination for nations with a higher and democratic culture, but opposed it when it provided a subterfuge behind which mere national aggrandizement lay hidden. He was opposed by Karl Kautsky. Kanov took over as editor of the Social Democratic theoretical journal Die Neue Zeit when Kautsky split to join the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, USPD, in 1917, and held the position until 1923 following the merger of the Independent Social Democratic Party with the Majority Social Democratic Party of Germany. Kanov was appointed in 1919 as an associate professor of social science and economic history at the Frederick William University of Berlin. In 1933, after the Nazi Party came to power, Kanov lost his pension and his writings were publicly burned. On the 20th of August 1936, he died impoverished and forgotten in Berlin. And Wikipedia says the Lensch-Kanov-Heinisch group was a political faction within the Social Democratic Party of Germany founded in 1915 by anti-revisionist Marxists who, despite previously opposing participation in the First World War, now supported participation in the First World War. The Lensch-Kanov-Heinisch group name comes from the three principal protagonists, Paul Lynch, Heinrich Kanov, and Konrad Heinisch. Kanov, Lynch, and Heinisch followed the initiative of Parvis in advocating a German victory as a positive step for international social democracy. They mobilized Marxist arguments behind the war effort. In 1907, Parvis had been a critic of German imperialism, publishing Colonial Policy and the Breakdown during the 1907 German federal election, often referred to as the Hottentot election. Back to the text. Trotsky's second target was the German socialist chauvinist or ultra-imperialist Lynch and Kanov, who had argued that imperialist expansion and integration had made the principle of national independence merely, quote, reactionary romanticism, end quote, clearly obsolete in any of its meanings, cultural, political, or economic. The third group whose position he rejected were the, quote, simplifiers in our revolutionary camp, end quote, who had asserted that the principle of national independence, bracket, in the sense of cultural autonomy, Trotsky should have added, and bracket in the sense of cultural autonomy, Trotsky should have added, end bracket, quote, is realizable only under socialism, and who thereby rid themselves of the necessity of giving a principled answer to the national question which had been posed point blank by the war, end quote. This seems unduly harsh on a group which a footnote identifies as, quote, the Polish, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Radek, etc., and the Dutch, Pannekoek, leftists, end quote, with whom Trotsky worked and thought closely on a range of important questions, especially against the Leninist fraction. The Polish left opposed Poland's unification and independence because it was espoused by nationalistic parties and also because it had been made obsolete by Poland's economic integration into Russian capitalist development. Trotsky was anxious to present a standpoint that combined recognition of the integration of the whole of Europe, and not only in the, quote, Poland-Russia, end quote, economic area, an acknowledgement of the enduring fact and value of national, cultural, and consciousness. At the center of Trotsky's proposed solution to Europe's national questions lay Trotsky's theory of imperialism, a phenomenon which Trotsky described, quote, as by its very nature both expansive and aggressive, end quote. Trotsky, however, thought that it was the aggressiveness or violence of the expansion, rather than expansionist drive in itself, that had made imperialism so overbearing and repugnant. Quote, the program of violent unification of Europe is just as characteristic of German imperialism as it is the tendency of French imperialism, ... End quote. Trotsky. We observed above that Trotsky saw imperialism as a perversion, or more aptly, an abortion, of the natural industrial capitalist evolution towards more centralized and planned economics. Trotsky's clearest and most concise statement of this idea was as follows, quote, imperialism is the capitalist thievish expression of this tendency of modern economy to tear itself completely away from the idiocy of national narrowness, as it did previously with regard to local and provincial confinement, end quote. Trotsky identified the root of this distortion in political, historical, rather than economic theoretical causes. Normal bourgeois industrial processes had been, so to speak, hijacked by, quote, the powerful opposition of the landed and capitalist classes in whose hands the tariff apparatus joined with that of militarism, without which the former means nothing, constitutes an indispensable weapon of exploitation and enrichment, end quote. Trotsky emphasized the role of landowners and financial interests, and more generally the narrow selfish ambition of the less advanced and more backward-looking sectors of the national economies, which are ever ready to use military power and, quote, artificial tariff barriers to block the flow of peaceful competitive market activities towards, quote, natural economic concentration and centralization. Trotsky may be said to have anticipated in essentials Joseph Schumpeter's famous theory, published some years later, of imperialism as social atavism. At this juncture, Trotsky was not concerned to discuss in greater detail the historical origins of imperialism, only to underline imperialism's deleterious consequences for economic productivity and for conventional forms of self-determination. Unlike Lenin, Trotsky did not believe that, quote, imperialism, its social and economic structures, its war-matured consciousness, represented the eve of the socialist revolution, the last stage of capitalism which socialism would directly replace and build on without pause or delay. Such a base, in Trotsky's view, could only be the industrial capitalist mode of centralization, which had been developing until it was overthrown and displaced by violence-permeated, partial and reactionary imperialist centralism. Although lacking in detail, there is to be found in Trotsky's wartime writings enough material to give us Trotsky's picture of that apparently lost paradise of industrial capitalist centralism, the consolidation of the bourgeois, quote, urge towards unifying the European market, end quote. 1 second. The mechanisms for such a process would have been the institutions of classical free trade liberal internationalism, indicated in the following passage, quote, to bourgeois politics, the destruction of, quote, internal European customs houses is an insurmountable difficulty. Without this, the interstate courts of arbitration and international law codes will have no firmer duration than, for example, Belgian neutrality, end quote. On the basis of such legal machinery, might have been built a common market quite different from the, quote, halfway complete and consistent economic unification of Europe coming from the top by means of an agreement of the capitalist governments, end quote. Again, in contrast to the imperialist oppression of weaker nations, the democratic nature of the industrial bourgeoisie's, quote, progressive unification would have been evident and defective in the real, quote, autonomy of bracket European and bracket nations, end quote, which would have accompanied and mediated that process. The defeat of the bourgeoisie by the combined class forces making up imperialist reaction had meant, in Trotsky's view, the dominance of the imperialist models of European economic integration, with decisive negative consequences for economic efficiency, democratic practice, and socialist prospects. It was therefore absolutely necessary to destroy imperialism and rehabilitate the bourgeois model in its essentials, but this could only be accomplished by revolution. Here we come to the pivotal point in Trotsky's argument. The bourgeoisie being now too demoralized to act, it fell to the proletariat to complete the bourgeois revolution and to unify Europe democratically. Quote, hence it is that the economic unification of Europe, which offers colossal advantages to producers and consumers alike, in general to the whole cultural development, becomes the revolutionary task of the European proletariat in its struggle against imperialist protectionism and its instrument, militarism, end quote. Trotsky. To Trotsky's mind, then, the first proletarian revolution would therefore be a, quote, bourgeois, parenthesis, radical bourgeois, end parenthesis, revolution, end quote, with the aim of creating an efficient capitalist economy that would be capable of producing the materially wealthy society, which the second proletarian revolution, the socialist revolution proper, would push forward to socialist construction. The idea of the proletariat having to complete the bourgeoisie's revolution against the bourgeoisie, or rather to renovate the bourgeois machinery of production, was not unique to Trotsky. It was also the controlling concept in Lenin's system, but while Lenin held it to be suitable only for the Russian situation, Trotsky more audaciously applied it to the whole European economic area. Quote, the program of the European, bracket, proletarian, and bracket, revolutionary movement would be the destruction of the compulsory anti-democratic form of the coalition, bracket, that is, imperialist unification, end bracket, and the preservation and extension of its foundations, in the form of the complete abolition of tariff barriers, unified legislation, especially labor laws, etc. In other words, the slogan, the United States of Europe, without monarchies and standing armies, would, become the unifying and guiding slogan of the European Revolution, end quote. New section, European Federation and Cultural Autonomy. We should pause to distinguish three propositions which Trotsky tended to run together in his uninterrupted line of thought. Firstly, that the victory of the proletariat over imperialism will install the Europe-wide dictatorship of the proletariat. Secondly, that the task of this proletariat state will be to implement the bourgeois-type unification of Europe. And thirdly, that this essentially, quote, economic union of Europe, end quote, will be the basis for the subsequent socialist revolution and reconstruction. The complex combination of these ideas is to be seen, for example, in statements such as the following, quote, over against the conservative defense of the antiquated national fatherland, we place the progressive task, namely the creation of a new higher, quote, fatherland of the revolution, Republican Europe, whence the proletariat alone will be enabled to revolutionize and to reorganize the whole world, end quote. Trotsky. In Trotsky's estimate, a united republican Europe, a fortiori, the Europe of imperialist warmongers, would not be immediately ripe for socialist revolution, but would have to experience further increases in productivity and efficiency, made possible by the capitalist-type unification, which Marxists have always taken to be a necessary condition for socialist construction. This sort of regime was usually labeled transitional, but it is more usually and precisely called revolutionary democratic, the ultimate stage in the evolution of bourgeois industrial capitalism. Owing to circumstances unforeseen by the classical theorists, it would come after a, quote, imperialist interval, and just before socialism. Trotsky saw such an order as both terminal and transitional. Quote, between our present social condition, bracket imperialism, end bracket, and socialism, there lies an extended period of social revolution, that is, the epoch of the open proletarian struggle for power, the conquest and application of this power with the aim of the complete democratization of social relations, and the systematic transformation of capitalist society into the socialist society, end quote. That statement was not merely rhetorical, but described the exact sequence of processes Trotsky envisaged. Firstly, the social democratic conquest of power from the imperialist in the First Revolution, as we call it, then the pushing of bourgeois democracy to its real limits, which are far more extensive than existing practice suggests. And thirdly, the transition to socialism by means, parenthesis, as the next sentence indicates, end parenthesis, of the, quote, expanding experiments of the proletarian regime and socialist reforms, end quote, which will at some point constitute the second, properly socialist revolution. We must now consider the nature of European unity, for which the social democratic revolution designed to restore and complete capitalist industrial democratic forms can and should aim. We must now consider the nature of European unity, for which the social democratic revolution designed to restore and complete industrial capitalist democratic forms can and should aim. Trotsky usually referred to the United States of Europe as in these statements, quote, the United States of Europe is the slogan of the revolutionary epoch into which we have entered, ... The United States of Europe, without monarchies, standing armies, and secret diplomacy, is therefore the most important integral part of the proletarian peace program, ... End quote, Trotsky. And, in Trotsky's concluding sentence, quote, the United States of Europe represents the form, the only conceivable form, of the dictatorship of the European proletariat, end quote. We noted that two fundamental factors led Trotsky to this construct, the irresistible process of centralization and expansion, and Trotsky's linguistic cultural concept of the nation. Imperialism was implicitly defined in Trotsky's scheme of things as centralism, dictated by and subservient to ultra-nationalistic politics or political nationalism. Against this specific form, Trotsky's United States of Europe would be both a weapon and an alternative. However, closer inspection shows that Trotsky used the formula of the United States of Europe to convey two distinguishable forms or stages which, in our interpretation, tacitly correspond to the two types or stages of the proletarian revolution. In the short term, Trotsky had in mind unification in the form of federation, and Trotsky consistently referred to, quote, a European federative republic, end quote, as the immediate aim of the revolution after as part of the overthrow of imperialism. There are 3 or 4 passages in this sense. For example, quote, the conversion of the imperialist trust into a European Republican Federation, end quote. In the medium term, they would follow the more rigorously centralized, quote, state unification of Europe, end quote, which Trotsky envisaged as the mature constitutional form for full, quote, economic union of Europe, end quote, corresponding to what we described above as his continent-wide variant of, quote, socialism in one country. Trotsky did not explicitly defend or explain his proposed federal structure, But we may suggest some of the considerations that must have entered Trotsky's mind. Firstly, in aligning Trotsky's self with the theorists who supported cultural national autonomy as the sufficient expression of self-determination, Trotsky would naturally have been drawn to their further demand for federal state systems to replace the existing multinational empires. Trotsky felt no need to go into the detailed institutions of the European Federation, since Trotsky probably comprehended it as patterned on the general lines of the Austrian proposals developed a decade earlier by the Austro-Marxist Renner and Bauer. On a different level, it is also not improbable that Trotsky intended a further and deliberate snub against Lenin, whose dislike for federalism, in both party and state organization, had already been made plain in numerous articles, and whose preference was strongly in favor of the breakup of the Eastern empires into various successor nation-states, rather than any federation of the nationalities in place of the Ancien regime. The federal scheme also possessed a certain logistical fitness in the immediate context of Trotsky's own argument for European economic union. For the old established historic nations of Europe, like France, England, and Germany, it would represent a, quote, step down from their now obsolescent nation-state and involved, in Trotsky's implicit argument, a not intolerable transfer of some sovereignty, in economic affairs mainly, to the central authority, while retaining autonomy and self-respect in other spheres. On the other hand, for the hitherto oppressed, stateless, quote, non-historic, end quote, nations, federation would be a, quote, step up from subjection and fragmentation to equal and secure national identity and autonomy in the sense that mattered most, their language and culture. Trotsky may be thought of as envisaging a gradual convergent movement of both groups towards equality and towards cultural autonomy for all nations, quote, under the roof of a democratically unified Europe, freed from state and tariff barriers, end quote. We refer to one last passage which summarizes Trotsky's thinking at this point in Trotsky's career to substantiate our interpretation of a two-stage unification, reflecting the two-stage revolution engineered by the Party of the Proletariat. Quote, the founding of a stable regime of proletarian dictatorship would be conceivable only if it extended throughout Europe, and consequently in the form of a European Republican Federation. The state unification of Europe, to be achieved either by force of arms nor by industrial and diplomatic agreements, would in such a case become the unpostponable task of the triumphant revolutionary proletariat. End quote. There is one other response from Trotsky to Lenin's critique of the slogan of the United States of Europe, which is of interest here. In Trotsky's earliest reference to the, quote, Republican United States of Europe, end quote, it was not clear whether this was to be a radical bourgeois democratic or a social democratic entity. Lenin's critique had demonstrated the impossibility or regressiveness of the former concept, that is, of a united democratic imperialist Europe, but he had not similarly ruled out meaningful democratic revolutions in individual states. Trotsky seemed to have accepted this point and moved to clarify his own revolutionary scheme, quote, the democratic Republican Union of Europe, end quote, Trotsky acknowledged, quote, is possible only, by means of revolts, in individual countries, with the subsequent confluence of these upheavals into a collective European revolution, end quote. Trotsky. The victorious European Revolution, Trotsky continued, quote, no matter how its repercussions may be fashioned in the various countries, can, in consequence of the absence of other revolutionary classes, transfer power only to the proletariat. Thus, the United States of Europe represents the only conceivable form of the dictatorship of the European proletariat, end quote. Here Trotsky was restating Trotsky's early concept, with a weaker emphasis on the, quote, simultaneity and uniformity of revolutions. The United States of Europe would come at the end of the first revolution, not as a precondition of the revolution. Trotsky thus deflected Lenin's strictures against the notions of democratic United States of Europe, a democratic United States of Europe, and a socialist United States of the world by proposing in effect the slogan of a socialist United States of Europe, quote, socialism in one continent, end quote. Quote, we have every reason to hope, end quote. Trotsky had declared, quote, that during the course of the present war, a powerful revolutionary movement will be launched all over Europe. It is clear that such a movement can only succeed as a general European movement. Isolated within national borders, it would be doomed to failure, end quote. Addressing himself directly to Lenin's main ambition and anxiety, Trotsky wrote, quote, the salvation of the Russian Revolution lies in the Russian Revolution's propagation all over Europe, ... And if in one of the European countries the proletariat should snatch the power out of the hands of the bourgeoisie, it would be bound, if only to retain its power, to place it at once at the service of the revolutionary movement in other lands, end quote. Nearly everything here would have been agreeable to Lenin, except perhaps Trotsky's characteristic, and to Lenin probably reckless readiness, in prophetic words, to, quote, place power, bracket, that is, revolutionary Russia's power, end bracket, at once at the service, end quote, of other revolutionary movements. Okay, so that is the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening.